Okie dokie. For some reason, it's not doing what it's supposed to do here. Why isn't it? All right, here we go. Voice, share. All righty. Willkommen. It's Wednesday again, and I am, of course, thinking about the different where I've been rolling along with some certain ideas, and I think you can sort of imagine where I was headed. And if you actually looked at the Medium page, I it's not so much that I simplified it or dumbed it down. I I decided to try to bring together some of these ideas that I've been fiddling around with and present them um, in a rudimentary sense. But even my rudimentary sense is probably too screwed up for some people. So, but I did it on Sunday for the Daily Coast Anti-Capitalist Meetup, and it did get a lot of response. I mean, I don't know. I think there were 80 comments or 60 comments, and that was it's pretty significant for that particular little synchronous session. Um, and it would have been worse had I not apologized at the front end for putting too many complex ideas or terms in. So, but I was being self-critical. I even wrote later on, or I've been writing, what is the problem with self-criticism or autocritique? And it's just as an aside, and I'm doing this, to front end what I'm going to talk about. Uh, there's a difference if you go and look at the sort of leftist or non-political idea about self-criticism. It becomes a pathological condition, which is pretty scary, actually. And then when you shift over to, Marxist Leninism or some other thing, autocritique or self-criticism is actually a key component in how things happen. You don't move as a collective, entity without some system of accountability or self-regulatory activity. It's really no different than what libertarians want in terms of self-governing ideas. But anyway, that's by way of saying what I wanted to do today is sort of look at some of the elements that I put in my little Daily Coast piece, because the Daily Coast piece actually was most of the things that I wanted to fiddle around with. So let me see if I can open this up. Oh God. Well, that's not helpful. Um, so anyway, this is what it looks like. Anti-capitalist meetup rethinking information property at a distance, making mediocre people dumber. So how I structured this was to put things like I usually do, try and put things that relate to the reader closer, that don't assume that know a bunch of stuff, and that it's topical or current, and hopefully entertaining and engaging. Maybe not entertaining, but just engaging. And so I put a couple of different things in there to make it work properly, or at least what I thought would work properly. Making mediocre people dumber is a quote from Ronnie Cheng, did the class day presentation at Harvard, and essentially the the trope or the meme from it, the takeaway, the soundbite was "fuck AI." I mean, he said it several times, and that's what we should do. Is it is a cautionary tale, and the expression "making media people dumber" is probably a reasonable idea, because if you use it, you can see how somebody who doesn't pay attention very much would get dumber. Um, it's just laziness, and there's proof for this. I mean, lawyers who put in briefs that they've rated or cranked up on AIs and get called for it because they just didn't even check what they did. And you know, I mean, well, anyway. So yes, there's actually real examples of how people are just too effing lazy um using AI. And yes, I that's by way of saying that what I did was a critique of AI, but I also put the whole piece under AI at the end to see how it did a summary of what I was talking about. And so I'll begin. I'll finally get there. They'll begin by looking at the synopsis or the summary of this little piece. Um, the fundamental point is uh, this idea that Pope Leo was talking about. I not that I read encyclicals or anything, but it was just interesting to see that the Pope, because he's a more modern guy, probably than Pope Francis, that he was concerned about intellectual or information property, and I thought that was a useful way to pivot the argument from just saying "fuck AI" to the Pope talking about information property and concentration of power and stuff like that in his encyclical. I mean, it's nice to have a American Pope who sort of is a little bit more keyed into this kind of stuff. On the other hand, well, anyway, that's for another day. So I tried to make it funny by putting in this standard meme, which the original meme is to have a guy, and there are three people. One is an attractive woman. The other one is not as equally attractive, actually. But the guy, obviously, wandering eye, looks like he's going to whistle a wolf whistle at the woman in red. And so there's the meme goes with these three people. So in this particular instance, you have just because it's a trope of some kind or a meme that is relatable to our the idea about a quantum reality or whatever, is that you have an observer, you have an observed quantum state, and then every other possible quantum state by repeating the other thing there. And hopefully people get that the idea of observation, or it's not a Schrodinger's cat sort of thing. It's more than that. The Schrodinger cat thing is like what I was talking about last week about Maxwell's demon. It's very similar, actually, without getting into the physics of it, I suppose, the theory of it. But it is this idea that Einstein talks about spooky actions at a distance, which is a very banal sort of way to talk about it, but it is this idea which I've been fiddling around with for a while, as you know, if you've been following what I've been doing, is this idea of indexicality, where things don't have to come in contact with other things in order to. And I mean, I know that sounds a little, mystical or magical, but it's the fact is we work indexically, and the standard, one is, if there's smoke, there's fire. My fire alarm goes off so that, I don't have to see the fire. I have to just simply act on the basis of the alarm. And that's an indexical relation, because if I don't see any smoke or fire, that doesn't mean that the fire, is doesn't exist. I mean, it could exist, and it's more like radon, probably a radon detector. But anyway, so that's kind of the way the whole little piece goes, and I'm not going to rehearse that here. What I will do, though, is go to the uh, summary, which I had the AI do. And so, looking at the article on the 31 May that I wrote, you look at it as a self-critique that depends on whether, I'm being, obviously metaphorical here, whether density is penetrable. Um, and that's being, self-conscious or self-critical or self-deprecating, because I do tend to write, moderately complex things, but I go back in and edit and try and fix stuff. So, and I try and make it intelligible. Sometimes I fail at it. Sometimes I assume that people are more well read, and I mean, I don't put the big words out there to either impress people or whatever. It truly is a theoretical problem, and I just don't have much tolerance on a engage the kind of issue adequately. And so that's why I put little other little popularized things to people for people to react people to react to, so that they don't get bogged down in the kind of density of discourse. And I also like showing that I can communicate in as crass and direct a way as anybody else. So there's that. So in that context, I put in a couple of videos because I happen to like Rick and Morty, because it really does provide useful examples, and Rick and Morty is about certain sciencey things. So there's a whole thing about slavery with extra steps that appears in a couple of episodes, and is generally a comment on capitalism, and it's quite interesting. In several different episodes, that's kind of what goes on. There's a comment on consumption during COVID, um, other things. It's quite interesting. But anyway, the specific episode has to do with um, fictive, imaginary or utopian cultures, and how if you could construct them in the sci-fi sort of way, if you had control over them, um, how would you be flummoxed if the people in, like in Men in Black, the was it the sequel, where they have these little people in a locker at Grand Central, and they worship the watch of one of the MIB people. And I've obviously wandered off there, but the point is, slavery with extra steps, and it's a repeating piece in that particular episode. And the idea that, and this actually comes up in other episodes too, about the idea that you know uh, people will do, they go through the steps of barter to money to exchange, and then there's usually a joke somewhere in there, like in the Purge episode. There's these things that obviously are that flip the joke over, or invert the joke. But anyway, so slavery with extra steps, because that's kind of what capitalism is, particularly under techno feudalism or technocracy, is a means by which you can reinstate essentially feudal relations. And that's kind of what they want to do now. It's take our healthcare away, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. And then I put in a video where Rick and Morty and Bigfoot battle the Pope. Now this is before Pope Leo, and sort of it's not a knock on Pope Francis. It's just actually it's kind of Pope Benedict, and if you really want to think about it. But anyway, um, so there's this whole thing about reincarnation, and whatever. let's not go too far down there. And then I included a video of Ronnie Chang at the class day, a lecture, uh, giving a cautionary tale about getting into AI. So all that by way of yammering for almost 20 minutes. So as another thought experiment, I just subjected the thing I wrote to an LLM AI to test whether it was making sense, even to the LLM, because I that's kind of your responsibility is to test whether the thing you asked it to work on was actually correct. And yes, and the logic, without rehearsing the whole thing before about critiques of AI, is that AIs do not think like people. I mean, it resembles thought, but it's sequentially different, has a limited corpus. It is just not the same. I mean, it runs at high speed, and it's always amazing because it does that, and it did that for mine too. It essentially took all the central arguments and sort of, cobbled them back together and summarized it, and actually made it's essentially the same sense I wanted to make, except, with less jargon, I suppose. So, yes, I appreciate the irony of using AI, but checking my text for errors should include how the LLM, the large language model, is being constructed. So, if anything, AI might be best at writing Cliff's notes. Those who are too young, Cliff's notes are the thing you use to cheat if you don't want to do the reading. But Cliff's notes actually are useful because they summarize the whole, business of whatever you had to read. But it's only about reading in that sense, and not ultimately the real problem, and that is to be able to reason against what the central ideas of whatever the hell you had to read. But it does encourage brevity, and so AIs essentially do elevator pitches. That is the thing that you wanted to talk, the project you wanted to talk about, but you only have the length of an elevator ride to sort of describe it to someone. So anyway, I reproduced it on Blue Sky, and so I use that as the sort of a way of putting in the link to the central text over at Daily Kos. So looking at looking at it as self-critique depends on whether density is penetrable, and that's being self-deprecating. Now, how an LLM treated my article as a summary, AI is useful for developing outlines, and I tend to use AI because they actually make tables, and that's a process that I appreciate. I mean, not that I would use it sort of without critical thinking and editing and reevaluation, but I like the fact that it cranks out tabular information quickly, and not that it's accurate. I mean, the thing about LLMs is they can hallucinate, or, in other words, they're taking certain things that are part of the building the model, but that they're limited because it's not really a human, it's not a human brain yet. And so it has, faults. So essentially that's what we're doing. I included before I put in the summary, because that's kind of where we'll probably end up. We'll get to the end of it maybe a little bit further today. Is a quote from a text discussing Althusser. And yes, Althusser, Jacques Althusser, Althusser is important in the sense that the person that I used in the article, Rick Wolf and Steve Resnick, I find that their basic text on comparing neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, and of course they talk about post-Keynesian as well, etc., and then Marxism, the three, sort of key elements, and they've been doing this for decades. That is, they did much earlier comparative text, and there are several other texts like this. So Hunt and King do one. There are several ones done by, left leftists to try and explain in a relatively rudimentary sense the difference between uh, neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, and Marxism, sort of Marxist political economy. And so you have this sort of trio that are always sort of worked against each other. And the point, of course, in doing this little exercise is to not avoid, but to allow yourself to not get tied up in the ideological conditions. And so you can discuss communism, capitalism, socialism, but that's not as important as sort of figuring out, as Wolf and Resnick refer to it, as a kind of set of entry points, which comes from Althusser, because Wolf studied with Althusser actually. And so anyway, the point being is that there's a certain point of view and a way to proceed that is actually useful for integrating or appropriating certain things that are important in the larger context of economics. That is, there's this thing that is called quantum economics. Now, whether it's good or bad or important, the interesting thing that is that it's built on certain neoclassical ideas. It's not built on Marxist ideas or even Keynesian ideas, and so what it provides appears to be, they present it as normative, but it's not really. It's easier. It's laziness. It's easier to do it as a neoclassical model because the numbers come out right, or it structurally looks better. It's more accommodating because neoclassical ideas are in the financial markets and stuff, so that thinking in quantum ways, it really works for certain elements of financial capitalism. Because you're working at velocity, you have lots of different variables, you got all kinds of stuff, and quantum ideas are useful ways to think about certain other things. And so that's kind of where, without getting into the math of it, but there is a math for it. And the math is actually a good math. I mean, it's a math that actually can serve radical purposes. And when I put the thing up in Coasts on Sunday, some people reacted to it by saying, "Oh, math is not important." No, math is important. I mean, kinds of math, certain types of math, and there's always problematic math too. The problem is, of course, statistics. You know, the statistics are problematic for all kinds of reasons, and part of it has to do with autocorrelation problems, identification problems. There's just stuff that just sort of comes with the problem of statistic itself. That's part of the history of statistics ultimately, and of course the more funkier problem about probability as a symptom of that. But anyway, so Althusser always wrote out of a conjuncture that was both philosophical and political. But even if we limit ourselves to the philosophical Althusser, we found that his legacy is already double. His legacy is already double. First, there is his tremendous theoretical effort to elaborate a rigorous dialectical materialism whose discourse would be adequate to its authentically materialist concepts. So in other words, you want your method to be as good as the stuff you're trying to work with or work against. At its core, this effort to produce texts that say what they mean and mean what they say is a philosophical project. It's everybody's philosophical project, actually, which, by purging the Marxian corpus, that is the body of Marxian literature and the tradition of speculative and empiricist backsliding. And yes, there is a tradition of speculative and empiricist backsliding. And with respect, all disciplines do that. It's just part of the process. So hopes to arrive at a Marxist science that is truly scientific. Now, the truly scientific thing is always a big problem because the claims to science have always been there, and they're there for every different discipline. But in the case of economics, the dominant model, and that's why I did this thing, is that the dominant example is sort of the mechanics or the the idea of mechanics from a physical science point of view is important uh, at one particular level, and because it arrives or is developed at the same time as classical economics, ultimately producing, and I've obviously shortened, compressed the whole set of ideas, but neoclassicism is a function of that set of ideas. Neoclassicism is kind of the dominant set of things, even though it's dominant ideas for economies, even though most people either will not recognize that it is that sort of theory and that it is kind of formally functionally a problematic for the obvious reasons that you have inflation, you have stagflation, depression, repression, recession. All of those things are symptomatic of the way that a capitalist economy operates. And Keynes came along to sort of fix some of those problems, liquidity and other things, and the role of the state in terms of fiscal policy. All of those things weren't fully attended to by neoclassicism. Neoclassicism doesn't think about that because it's too messy, and because it has to ultimately account for how capitalism itself operates, which cannot sustain itself. Ultimately, if you really, read stuff, you can, or just you can see that it really has issues, and they can be deleterious, and it can be horrible. So anyway, now what emerges as a surprise, however, is that the conceptual work that produces science takes place not at the well-established center of Marxian theory, but at those marginal sites where Marxist theoretical rigor falters. And that's the kind of underlying issue for a lot of Marxian thought. It had and don't believe me. You just look at the videos on YouTube. You can just see that there are these issues are still there. They've been there. They reproduce themselves. They have followers. They have personality cults. It's all there. And so, you want to sort of work around that and get to a position where you can actually get to more science-oriented things that have less to do with ideological elements or hegemony or those other things, basic personality disorders that are part of every academic discipline. So a science only progresses, i.e. lives, this is Althusser, by the extreme attention it pays to the points where it is theoretically fragile. By these standards, it depends less for its life on what it knows than on what it does not know. That is, its absolute precondition is to focus on this unknown and to pose it in the rigor of a problem. So Althusser, long story short, you get a essentially a commentary that resembles, not identical to, falsification and other things that you would need to build a science, or to at least meet the criteria of some people who want to claim that something is a science or scientific. And of course, that's a concept that is really at risk when you have people worrying about raccoon penises and stuff. So it's just we're at a very bad point relative to that. So here is the summary, and I'll read the summary, and then maybe there's time to discuss the actual article itself. So I didn't, I used, not necessarily wrote, but used 20,000 words to kind of get the thing to work properly. And it took not a fair amount of work, but it did crystallize, or at least organize some of the basic ideas that I've been fiddling around with. That is, can we get a radical political economy? Can we use analytic concepts without falling into the trap of analytic Marxism? Because it is a trap. And can we use other methodologies to meet the kind of questions that Wolf and Resnick are saying? Well, you got to deal with the essentialist problems of neoclassical economics. You got to see that it's only a band-aid. Keynesianism is a band-aid, and that ultimately you have to go to something that is much more critical, uh, uh, not necessarily mathematical, but more widely critical of other social things, which are part of all the stuff that gets torn out of neoclassicism in order to get it to work. And lest you think that's unimportant, somebody like Paul Krugman gets his Nobel Prize because essentially he decides he's going to read some geography. Uh, that's oversimplifying it, and I apologize if Paul ever reads this. Um, but it these are ideas that have been around for a while. It's just that finally somebody in economics decided to, at that particular moment in history, decided to look a little bit more broader at geographical questions. So anyway, so the text is a dense, yes, anti-capitalist critique that intertwines Marxist political economy, AI, skepticism, quantum economics, and a specific recent political scandal involving the Trump administration and energy policy. Written in a style the author admits is intentionally complex. It argues against techno-feudalism. Varoufakis doesn't have a trademark thing on this. There is a kind of techno-feudalism out there. You could sort of see it, and it's called techno-feudalism now, but it was no different at various other elements going back to trust busting in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's pretty much the same deal. In other words, you had the Pullman strikes, robber barons. Well, that's all. That's 19th and 20th century. That's techno feudalism. But anyway, and the concentration of power in big tech and corporate capital. Here's a summary of the key points. This is the AI writing this. The danger, number one, the danger of AI and McKinseyization. Now, McKinsey is a very large consulting firm, think tank, whatever. Pete Buttigieg, worked for them for a while. And what they are is a neoliberal, I would assert, attempt to adjust the capitalist economy, essentially. But they consult in a whole variety of areas, and ultimately they are kind of the optimum thing that neoliberalism would like, is that it's not necessarily technocratic, but it is corporatist. That's how they get their money, is to consult with corporations. So it is a kind of class activity, not unlike the managerial class arguments that managerial professional class arguments that are prominent. I mean, Catherine Liu talks about it now or in the last couple of years, but it really was it Barbara Ehrenreich's idea at the front end about with some other folks, about a managerial professional class argument. So, but it got revived, and Catherine Liu talks about it, and that's fine because it's still viable, and you can see it in McKinsey. McKinsey is kind of the sort of perfect peer example of it in terms of, it's sustainable as a thing. It produces a certain class position. It doesn't really give a shit about, labor. So that's the other part of it. Anyway, the danger of AI and McKinseyization. The author argues that AI is being used not to liberate labor, because that's one of the front end arguments about AI, is that it would do the same thing as in the 19th century to provide leisure time and, whatever, and, the 10-hour work week or whatever, which is all, BS, as we know. But to make mediocre people dumber and to act as a tool for mass layoffs and wealth concentration. Lest you think that's unimportant. That's going on right now. And it's happening at all levels. That is, today, it's being used to essentially kill the probably one of the best electronic journalism entities that's existed, at least in my lifetime, and that is 60 Minutes. It's sort of the pure example of how journalism and the political sphere and et cetera, it begs to do that and the fact that certain capitalists, actually technocrats, want to kill it and gather in other sort of right-wing nut jobs is sort of part of the thing. So act as a tool for mass layoffs and wealth concentration. The metaphor. Now you see, this whole thing could just exist as analogies and metaphors, but the point of doing this whole exercise here is to go beyond. It's to go beyond, spooky action at a distance. You're really talking about actual action and actual distance, which fundamentally is a math problem. I mean, the difference between numbers between numbers and geometry is really the ultimate. That's kind of where it all goes back to, in terms of it just forces us all to go back and look at math books. But anyway, the metaphor, the text proposes viewing AI as a management consulting firm like McKinsey & Company, just as McKinsey helped normalize layoffs and the opioid crisis for profit. Now, that's the kind of key thing that doesn't get talked enough about. But anyway, AI is expected to reduce labor costs and boost corporate profits without raising the standard of living for the median worker. So you get exactly what the critique of, Piketty's argument, is that over the long run, you're getting divergence between wealth or intergenerational wealth and, people's incomes. It's capital and ideology, as Piketty gets to in his second book, I think, whatever. So the class angle, this is the AI talking, because I don't use that use terms in that way, but it's sort of interesting how it kind of boiled it down to that. The class angle, citing Ronnie Cheng, the author suggests AI reinforces class hierarchies unless specific economic policies are in place to distribute its benefits. So that's the sort of fundamental critique of these kinds of things, whether it's managerial professional class or a variety of other activities, or, Trumpism, sort of rump libertarianism in that sense. So number two, the quantum political economy. The piece advocates for a new, and it's not that new, but it's been around for a decade or so, new interdisciplinary framework called quantum political economy. Now, there's a little group of folks, a couple of them are mathematicians and physicists, so it has that. But the background to this is that econophysics has reemerged, or the analogy between economics and physics, as it's always been there, but it's sort of come back with a roar, not because of quantum theory or necessarily. It's just simply that econophysics was always there. It's just that people tended to work at the margins, as Althusser points out. People worked at the margins and tried to, and that's the whole marginalist thing, is that you're working on these little elements, and it's not unlike how capitalism operates now. That is, it's quite acceptable to some capitalists to be corrupt, and the corruption happens in the margins with, for example, asymmetric information. It happens in the shadows. It's the informal economy, it's the offshore economy, all that crap is running at the margins, where money is converted, where, finance operates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it's globalized. So beyond analogy, it argues against, my little piece argues against simple metaphors connecting physics to economics, suggesting instead that quantum models like entanglement and uncertainty can provide rigorous tools to analyze complex socioeconomic process. Now, the fact is, an idea that resembles entanglement, not called entanglement, and certainly uncertainty are part and parcel of discussions within the context of economics in general. Doesn't matter which subfield you want to talk about or your political position. Entanglement and uncertainty really are part of the whole deal. And it's not that it's ideology free, but that is simply part of the mechanism, and that what pointing out something like you use quantum in a kind of heuristic way to get people to kind of go, oh, okay, that's kind of the frame we have to start working with. And yes, that goes to a whole issue of about paradigm shifting and incommensurability and blah, 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 blah. But that's for another lecture. So information property, this is what the Pope was talking about, calls for rethinking information property, that is patents, algorithms, and data as a universal good, drawing on a fictional or futuristic encyclical by Pope Leo. So it already is hallucinating about, the viability of religious documents and the Pope. And then the Pope's role, the text references a 2026 encyclical by Pope Leo, which warns against the concentration of technology in the hands of a few and calls for solidarity and subsidiarity to counter big tech pseudo-religious influence. So on the one hand, the Pope's being topical. On the other hand, this is no different than, Luddites in the early 19th century breaking machines because they were part of the problem. They're not the problem. They were just part of the problem. Now, so I used a case study, and that's kind of poorly formed, but I thought it was a good idea to talk about how the federal government, or at least certain corrupt people in the federal government, decided that they would give a French energy company $1 billion to not build or to not engage in wind farm construction on the east coast of the United States, where North Carolina, and there's a bunch of projects, go all the way up into New England. New York is the bigger issue, just from a centralization point of view. But anyway, and yes, there are other collateral elements and unintended consequences and a whole bunch of other things. But the point is to give a French company $1 billion to not do something, and rather what it was encouraging, or this is a payment to do, is to direct efforts not to renewable energy, but to essentially invest in fossil fuel companies in Texas. So already the whole thing is about accountability, corruption, political economy, politics, congressional oversight, regulatory, it's got all that stuff. But the point, of course, is that it's a very complex issue. And it's not unique. Other things like this have existed within the context of capitalism, but it's probably more focused now because you have people doing their corruption in the open. So Total Energy's wind farm deal, the author uses a specific and likely hypothetical or speculative, given the 2026 date, political event to illustrate capitalist corruption. The deal. And I appreciate the AI, sort of say deals and swaps and others. It does, on the one hand, it oversimplifies. On the other hand, I appreciate the structure, the deal. And because, of course, as the Trump administration allegedly paid $928 million using the federal judgment fund. So essentially, you're using something that would normally be used in terms of compensation for tort problems or whatever, to be an incentive. I mean, it's just totally corrupt. It's just taking it off the top to French energy company Total Energies to abandon offshore wind farm projects off New York and North Carolina. The swap, in exchange, Total Energies committed to investing in oil and gas projects in Texas and the Gulf of Trump, or the Gulf of America, or whatever. So the critique, the author views this as a national security lie, because that's actually what it was. National security, as usual, is used as a rationalization, like the ballroom crap, used to subsidize fossil fuels and throttle renewable energy, highlighting the quote-unquote metabolic rift. I appreciate the AI trying to integrate certain issues that I brought up. The disconnect between capitalism and nature. So the AI was thinking ahead on this. It knows, because it is an LLM, that metabolic rift is a critique done by certain Marxists, uh, uh, radical ecologists, to talk about Marx's original metabolic ideas that are still useful today. But it represents only one part of an entire discourse on, sort of left views about ecology and environmental economics and a whole bunch of other things. And the corruption of democratic institutions. Now, that there's a whole story there, but that essentially that was what it boils down to. So, number 4, language and accessibility. The author self-consciously acknowledges the tension between clarity and jargon. They reference the two traditions of translating Marx. That is, there's an Engels-Moore tradition. That is, the what Marx wrote should be accessible to trade unionists, to workers. And then the other tradition is, and this is a problem because the academic jargon heavy stuff goes all the way back to Lenin, or even Engels himself, relative to the Gotha program and blah 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 blah. There's other, Marx is dealing with some pretty heavy duty academic jargon heavy stuff, and to just put it on to Althusserien and New Left Review is a little short-sighted, but that's the kind of the way LLMs hallucinate. They don't necessarily fill in all the historical elements, and sometimes don't, or put off giving you the adequate reference in order to get it to work properly. So Althusserien, New Left Review. New Left Review is a book. It's a journal that, and without going into the whole story of it, is there to kind of crystallize certain oppositional points of view in post-war political economy stuff, radical politics, etc., that thereby the quote-unquote new left notion. That is, and of course the implication is that there's an old left, whatever that means, which is, it's a whole bunch of things, orthodox ideas, diamat, a whole bunch of things that are there that are still there. There's still, constant fractures and accusations and purges and, denunciations, all that. It comes because of this kind of ways in which we translate Marx. And yes, there's all kinds of details about this. You could even argue that German is probably the way to look at Marx, except that he wrote in French and in English. So that's really not a good argument. But it is a question you want to raise relative to the new translation of Marx's first volume of Capital by Princeton, which came out 2 years ago. The author admits to failing their own promise to write clearly. Yes, I give up. Using complex terms to discuss complex topics, while arguing that bad metaphors in economics can lead us astray. And yes, bad metaphors do lead us astray. People build entire policies on bad metaphors. And, you can critique stuff empirically and et cetera, quantitatively, but ultimately some problems are just bad metaphors. Anyway, unless you think that's unimportant, there are conservative, or however you want to think of them, historians of economic thought who work on the problem. There's a literature of economic rhetoric. It's a side literature, but an interesting literature, but not pursued adequately, I would assert, by a whole bunch of people. But it's still there, and it continues on, and there are very interesting practitioners of it. But anyway, conclusion 5. The text concludes that the climate crisis is capitalogenic. Now, the point there is the kind of position that you have between the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, the idea that humans, affected, geologic history or whatever. And it's not just humans, but now, as some people would argue, and it is a problematic argument, that capital is more important to focus on. And yes, that's really just simply a 19th century argument, but that's kind of where we are, is you got to get a product out there, you got to get branded, you got to, it's all kind of problematic and promotional, and yes, the left does that too. So anyway, that's a whole nother story. That is, capitalism itself has caused the climate crisis, and I would refer to, or I introduce the idea of a deconstructionist critique. And yes, there is a deconstructionist critique. I mean, deconstructionism was an idea that was in the last century, and a lot of people don't follow it for a whole variety of reasons. But it's still useful. It has certain methodological positions that largely are a deal with text or certain other ideas, and they are in fact an extension of post-structuralist ideas. Uh, but anyway, that expose power dynamics, wealth concentration, and the ideological control of big tech. So we didn't have to use a big word like deconstructionist critique, but ultimately you sort of have to, break the whole business open and deconstruct. That is, take something and not demolish, as one type of person would think that's what deconstruct means, but rather, semantically speaking, it is to both reconstruct and reconstruct and then reconstructing it again. That's essentially what deconstruction describes. Similarly, degrowth as a idea has exactly that same set of idea. Some would argue that. Well, anyway, that's an argument. It suggests that now that only a radical, democratic alternative to current economic models, incorporating insights from physics, semiotics. Yes, another problematic term and idea, but as if you've been following my yammering the last couple of weeks, I resurrected all this other things that I was fiddling around with, and then brought it back to the front because it got brought back to the front by the French as usual. But there's really a good collection that sort of argues this problem more forward. That is the analogy or metaphor, the problem of economics, you know, uh, linguistics and economics, and ultimately a science of human signs. And yes, the claim is a human science, which is ultimately the issue that's been there for a century, is asking certain questions about what would constitute a human science. Not that I'm answering it, but there are various ways in which you could talk about sort of scientific ideas, that is, ideas that are constructed, that have a logic, that are falsifiable, that, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things, physics, semiotics, and Marxist theory, can address the metabolic rift and the threat of techno-feudalism. So the AI, aside from my yammering on the side here, gives us a way of encapsulating. It's a check on my own, yammering, and so the AI sort of corrected or fixed a lot of this stuff. So, or at least simplified it in a way that made it intelligible. Let's put it that way. And I can go back to the whole structure, but that's sort of the end. The front end of this story, has, other than the weird videos and other stuff, it essentially covers those basic set of ideas. I in the front end, the article I put in on Medium essentially covers the diagrams, the charts that I included, which are useful charts. I mean, the idea of econophysics and quantum economics is actually an important one, because there are people who, and not so much indulge quantum economics, although there will be people who do that, but most of them currently are physicists and mathematicians. And econophysics is something indulged by a fair number now of economists, particularly post-Keynesian economists, who, on the one hand, are looking at the classical political economy, but also looking at the kind of, classical mechanics, that is, a Newtonian, ideas of physics that are important to make certain types of quantitative judgments. So if you look at Anwar Sheikh's work, just look at his lectures. You can see where he's headed. And he does make actual reference to econophysics at some moment, not only in his 2016 text, but in his lectures. So I point you in that direction, if only to show you that there is a fair amount of activity. The other person who really does this, following on Mockover and what's it, the issue of large scale structural dynamics stuff in economics, Steve Keen, who is doing really interesting stuff, has done really interesting stuff to critique the whole problem of, sort of the royal, sort of problem of economics. And he's written some very good works on that, some fundamental, very fundamental texts, and offers up currently still a critique of those kinds of matters. Um, so, and yes, it resembles physics, but it's physics in the sense that you need certain structural models that can only be modeled, in terms of math and certain things that come from issues in physics that are primarily about, particle physics. But ultimately, there's a wave theory thing going on there too. So and there's other stuff going on. So, I included a chart that does that. I uh, I wanted people to say, well, quantum economics tends at the current moment, that is, in the 10 years that people have been fiddling around with quantum economics, it has tended to support certain uh, uh, neoclassical ideas. But as I said before, it's because the applications are fairly obvious. That is, if neoclassicism is a dominant methodology, you're naturally going to use whatever new tool in that thing, and it fits very well because of the idea that a complex financial modeling does have a lot of the potentially quantum elements, and that's the current discourse on it, is to show that there are certain things, there's certain ideas that work there. Now, on the other hand, the same ideas, or at least something adjacent to that, can be used in the context of a radical political economy. So, and I would assert to you that a Hilbert space, for example, has nothing to do with capitalism itself, but is actually a really good tool to sort of, pry it open and sort of fix problems. So that's, and I picked the example because it's a complex example, that is one that is, on the one hand, ecological or environmental, but also is clearly a policy problem, and also a major contradiction. That is, efforts or money or capital dedicated to renewables is suddenly hijacked and actually incentivized to do the thing that it was meant to fix. That is, to invest in oil and gas in Texas. I mean, ultimately, that's just the scam. I mean, it's the same scam that occurred with, attacking Venezuela. I mean, it's the same thing. It is the same thing. Ultimately, it's propping up refineries and other things that are in Texas. And unless you think that's all about Texas and it's picking on Texas, it's not really picking on Texas. The fact is, there's a lot of Saudi money in Texas. The whole whatever it is, the liquid natural gas facility there is, I think, built by Saudi Arabia in Houston or wherever the hell it is. So it's already there, and it's fairly obvious that it's not a domestic problem but a global problem. So I included some of those things, and I picked up a little chart from Brookings that I think it was from Brookings. Anyway, it's related to that and the Federal Reserve. Um, the idea is that tangible and intangible capital is at work here. That is, and you can actually taxonomize it or typologize it. You can say, oh, okay, well, there's a whole bunch of different things that are at work at the same time that we need to sort of accommodate. So cryptocurrency, for example, um, other things that relate to the supply stream, patents, and all of those things are there. I mean, all of those things are part of the problem. And of course, petroleum reserves, oil exploration, obviously. And I like the fact, and this is kind of where I started. Originally, I had started looking at the problem of electromagnetic spectrum policy and trying to work that out as a problem in capital, and that is not simply ethereal. That is, it's not simply because electromagnetic spectrum is sort of out there and sort of doesn't have constraints. It does have constraints, and in particular in the and telecommunications industry, it's very constrained by things like cell phone towers, microwave, dishes, antennae, and a regional difference and I mean, it exists at several different levels. That is, it's the tech side of it, but then you have ultimately other problematic elements. That is, the cell phone network itself. That is, it's the either monopolization of or territorial control of providers, infrastructure, the problem of networks themselves, and then ultimately the current issue, as we know, is server farms, or data farms, whatever you want to talk about it. They're ultimately complex problems because a large scale, and this is a whole capitalist problem too, is that it's too large, is these large server things, Google et al., have incredible energy costs. And that's the thing that's been used to criticize them, is that they suck up water and, things that we would normally assume are quote unquote natural, and they're not natural. And so you have all these other issues that are going on, and no different than the same capital, as I would assert, with the current scam of the Department of Homeland Security buying or leasing, however you want to talk about it, acquiring large warehouses to hold detainees at a rate that is clearly about grifting and, corruption. I mean, it's just there in the data. I mean, the fact is, if you start with a facility that's only, 10 or $20 million, and then suddenly, only 3 years or 4 years later, buy it or sell it, or there's a whole set of transactions for 120 million, not much has changed in the physical building itself. There's something else going on, and the money is not a local money, and it's not a federal money, but rather it's kind of manipulated through a whole bunch of other kind of transactions that have to do with New York capital. The thing itself is being, built in wherever the hell it is, Virginia or whatever, Maryland. So there's that part of the story. So I've talked far too long. I've gone not necessarily over my time, because I usually go 90 minutes. So that's kind of, so I was discussing this as the chart that describes different types of capital, and I think a quantum model can accommodate these little differences, that where things are either standardized, exclusive, or not exclusive, or all of those things, as I think you can see, you have to accommodate from a mathematical point of view. And that's, these are just generalized categories. These aren't absolute or fixed categories, but they do range the whole bunch of things you've got there. So if you're discussing a wind farm being diverted to Texas, wind farm money being diverted to Texas, you're also talking about land issues, regulatory issues, original auction prices, because there's a thing there, and then the structure of the utilities industries in both locations, the fact that it's a foreign a source of capital, and then there's a whole money laundering thing that undoubtedly is going. I mean, really, truly, it's nothing about this is on the up and up. And and it really goes back to other issues that were sort of revealed only by crisis. So that, for example, the big Deepwater Horizon um, disaster in the Gulf of America, the then Gulf of Mexico, revealed a whole set of problems in, sort of the mineral. There's a whole agency that does, mineral stuff that includes oil and fossil fuel and stuff. There's a whole set of issues there that is not closely watched by a bunch of folks. And part of that is why the Deepwater Horizon, disaster occurred at all, for a variety of other, regulatory reasons and oversight and technological issues and blah 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 blah. Unless you think that's unimportant, that's currently the same issues are persist. And as we know from the current war, that's it reveals the real problems. That there is some relation to the price of gasoline that for your automobile, but it has all these other kind of things going on that are part of it. And of course, at the current moment, Trump has dipped into the national oil reserves and he's exhausting it essentially in order to keep the price below $5 a gallon. And not enough people are talking about mainstream media certainly isn't talking about this, but these facts are occurring. So anyway, that's part of the way I've started. So what you need is a quantum model to sort of work through these large questions. So some hypothetical questions or research questions, demand destruction is this other idea that needs to have a critique built into it. And the idea of a demand destruction as opposed to supply destruction has its own kind of historical set of issues and or framing or branding or however you want to talk about it. So how are US natural gas prices so low in the midst of a global natural gas crisis, while US natural gas exports are at record highs? So, in one sense, you have the entire complexity of problems that are not only part of liquid natural gas, but that are also part of fracking, U.S. fracking, which is why the U.S. natural gas exports can be so high. But the reality, of course, is that it's not all from one place, and that, as you've discovered from the war, is that what is it, 5 to 10% of liquid natural gas comes out of UAE or Qatar or whatever. I think it's UAE, and that's an issue because obviously it screws up the entire dynamic, the set of markets, and then it gets to the issue of there's a difference between Russian shadow ships that are largely, a certain type of tanker that is potentially more problematic for a variety of reasons, and none the least of which is who owns them or who uses them or who insures them, but also that liquid natural gas carriers are different as well, as we sort of discovered with that sinking of one in the Mediterranean recently. And we still don't know who did it. Now, some people say it's the Ukrainians, but this is the middle of the Mediterranean. And there are all kinds of other issues at work when you sink a liquid natural gas carrier or set it ablaze or whatever in somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean. So that's another issue. All right. So I included a thing on, that carbon credits would be part of the analysis because you could use a not because you believe in cap and trade, but that carbon credits are one way of measuring the problem. And that's one whole set of things that fit into your quantum model. But it's not the only thing. And the other background problem in this is that you need, an entire apparatus to work through the issues of carbon markets and carbon, amelioration, or there's far too many different things going on when you think about carbon as a commodity. So carbon commodities are you need something like a quantum model to sort of work it through, because it's not simply, it's carbon. I mean, it's a bunch of things. So anyway, there's that, and then the usual matters, and I included stuff by Wolf and Resnick to critique that. So I mentioned econophysics and stuff, and then the front end, of course, is uh, these are contending economic theories, and that they have different theories of value. And I think it's important to recall, from a methodological point of view, that to use the entry point idea is useful because it does allow for adjustments, modifications, and transformations. The logic is different between Marxism, neoclassical economics, and Keynesian economics. As Wolf and Resnick explain, it's about explaining or figuring out, defining or interpreting um, uh, various determinations. So there's this concept of overdetermination, which is used in a variety of ways, including psychoanalysis. But that's a whole nother set of issues. And Althusser, kind of flirts with that, and then the other people have taken moved the ball down the field further in that way. But overdetermination is also used mathematically and in neoclassical economics, but not in the identical way. And so there's this underlying critique that Wolf and Resnick are important to sort of work through. Um, and it is about the difference between entry point logic and the object. Now, the object problem, of course, is prices, and we all together are far too easily, sort of submit to using prices as a way of thinking about these things, when in fact the real problem ultimately, and it's a Marxian problem, is about value. And it's not because they're different or the same, that they're just different entry points into capital. And they're problematic in different ways, because the value question has other obviously social and political issues built into it, and moral issues, as it were. And prices, by comparison, appear to be amoral. They aren't, but you can see where that goes. And a quantum model would allow us to be able to assess all of these things, concurrently. Um, and it would provide, with all due respect to history, ways of assessing certain historical models. Kondratiev long waves and a bunch of business cycle stuff and whatever. All of those things, I think, are better analyzed, and particularly this wave thing, obviously, because it waves also amplitudes and cycles and stuff. I'll go back to the original econophysics sort of thing, and even though it wasn't called econophysics in the 19th century. So, what this idea is, of course, from a Wolf Resnick point of view, and there's a moderately new text on the so-called Amherst School that collects some of these ideas, but doesn't. I don't think there is one Amherst School. There's a bunch of different things that have come out of Amherst that are, interesting, and have they diverge into a whole bunch of different other things. But you can talk about totalities in a variety of ways. You can talk about it centralized, you can talk about it decentralized, but also you can talk about it as distributed. Now, this distinction is not new. This goes back to, I mean, 40 years ago, there were still discussions about just distributed computing. So it's really not that different. It's just the hardware, the infrastructure is better. And then I plowed through a variety of other issues. The front end of the article talks about the analogy of economics with physics, and I obviously use the AI to sort of work through the outline, because the AI is useful for those things. You have to go back in and say, Well, you can make the contrast between atoms are identical and passive, they don't change based on observation. Now that raises a whole bunch of other things that gets back to our, Maxwell-Demon problem. Um, Economics by comparison. And so you're talking about agency. And the issue at the front end is that, you know, uh, atoms don't have agency. I mean, in that sense. But humans, of course, because they are reflexive, this is the problem of the demon, of the Maxwell demon. Humans are heterogeneous, irrational, and reflexive. There are a bunch of other things too, hairless apes and all that. But so there are these issues that need to be squared away, and I think that a quantum political economy, whatever that might be, or just quantum models within the context of radical political economy, would help certain types of models, certain types of ways of thinking about the problem that are, I would assert, a little bit more empirically viable or commensurable in terms of building research programs, as opposed to other things that don't really quite have that same viability, but that are there are people insist on teaching them, which is the whole sad element of how economics is taught. Steve Keen has written some great stuff on why that's a problem. So I won't have to do it here. You can look it up for yourself. Um, I mean, Keen goes a little further than that. He says there shouldn't be any field, undergraduate speaking, there shouldn't be an economics department. You just should be over in the engineering department or something, which I would assert is not, taking a little too far. But because I think that as with radical political economy, you really actually have to start to integrate the models and get it to work out properly. So anyway, so this may confuse you further, but I urge you to sort of look at this, the comments on this article, because I used Paul Cockshot's blog piece to start this off, because he talks about similar issues, that is overdetermination, among other jargon problems, and it's actually a reasonable little article on the one hand. On the other hand, he represents his own issues with Western Marxism and a bunch of other things. But people would critique my little piece saying that I'm, following Paul Cockshott, but I'm not. I respect and I'm interested, very interested in his work, and see that as the ultimate problem underlying this is machine learning problems relative, which is part of why quantum is important. Machine learning problems are going to be part of this, solving economic problems. And the sooner we move it into a position where it's doing good as opposed to doing evil, we'll be better off. So anyway, I've used up all my time now, or at least the limits of my time. And so I will, and I didn't even have to go to the article itself. I, sort of breezed through it here and introduced you to the outline, the Cliff's Notes version, which is relatively okay. I mean, there's some of the issues underlying this. If I were going to rewrite it, there are areas in here that I would rewrite that I think that the AI was made some conclusions, sort of provisionally, that aren't quite correct. So that there's that. But as I say, I used it as a sort of thought experiment. You sort of want to go, well, if the AI does something with this, what is it doing? And so that's the other side of the question. Um, and yes, I agree with a variety of folks here that AI has the potential to destroy us all. And it's going to be a problem, unless vigilance and ruthless criticism occur. And so that's kind of where we need to go. I'm going to shut off the live stream, I think, without commenting too much on the questions relative to the chat. Well, maybe I should. There's other things. Marx, meant something more specific. Yeah. It's not about defending Marxism. I mean, ultimately, that's still the problem. Because I don't think Marx was, Marx didn't know anything, obviously, about quantum stuff, but he was thinking about the whole metabolic rift thing is a kind of commentary on that sort of set of problems. And we don't really get that from Marx as much as we get it from Engels. So that's a whole nother thing. Um, anyway, so that's comments on that. I think yes, Catherine Liu on the professional managerial class. Um, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I'm gonna stop here, shut the live stream off, and then shut the share off. So we get to the front end. Oh, and I will thank you very much for your attention. God.
I like this table.